Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rediscovering Readers Advisory, the first session in what will be a series of workshops called Magellan and You, Librarians as Information Navigators. This workshop was designed specifically with school librarians and public librarians who work with children and youth in mind, but I think everybody can get a little something out of it. So if you don't work with children and youth, don't be put off. We've got stuff for you too. So let's talk learning objectives. After participating in this workshop, attendees will be able to, 1, identify a book's elements of appeal, 2, understand the importance of title curation, 3, understand the importance of involving your school community, and 4, learn how to utilize social media for readers advisory. So let's talk about media. There is so much media out there. We're consuming various types of media pretty much all day long. We're getting it when we read or when we watch the news, when we listen to the radio or a podcast, when we read articles online or scroll through media or listen to Spotify. The same is true for our students. When they're in the classroom learning, they're consuming media. A lot of us probably think of media as being electronic. When we say media, we generally think of TV or YouTube or Instagram, but it's books too. It's the textbooks students are using in the classroom. It's the books they're reading on their own time. Books are media. So we have to ask ourselves, with all this other media vying for their attention literally 24/7, why would they pick up a book? Boredom isn't something that our kids are having to deal with in the same way that we did as children. There is always some kind of media screaming for their attention. Most kids aren't going to pick up a book just out of a lack of something to do. They're only going to do it if we've fostered a real love of reading and we've helped them to build up those habits that have them reading for an hour before bed or on the bus in the morning or on the weekends. So let's take a quick look at this map developed by Russia Beyond the Headlines that illustrates the number of hours on average that people in various countries reported reading per week. Again, this is what they've reported reading. It's important to remember that when you're looking at a statistic like this. So we'll see India is way up there at 10 hours and 42 minutes per person per week. And if you are looking for the US, we are way down there in the 4th row at about 5 hours and 42 minutes per week. So just keep that in your mind as we go on from here. Okay, so let's talk about what makes us like a book. We call them elements of appeal. You might have heard this term before, you might not have, but when we get there, you will absolutely know what it refers to, even if you don't know the term. So Novelist, which is a fantastic service, by the way, if you have the opportunity to subscribe to it, I do highly recommend it. I'm not sponsored by them or anything like that. I just think that they are a fantastic service and I do use them all the time. So what makes us like a book, what we find appealing, are the characteristics of the book. They're the parts that make up the sum of the book. And unfortunately, right now, our cataloging systems are a little bit lacking when it comes to helping us identify those traits. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but let's just look at these elements of appeal. So this list, this elements of appeal list, it was put together by Novelist, and I think it's a pretty darn good list of appeal factors. So appeal goes deeper than genre or subgenre. So to really get at what Heather Acero calls the GUI Center of Readers Advisory, it's an amazing term. Think about, say, I'll use a couple of adult titles as an example. Think about Red Mars and The Martian. They're both sci-fi books. They even take place on the same planet, but they couldn't be more different, right? I love The Martian. It's one of my all-time favorites, but I never could get into Red Mars. The Murderbot Diaries, though, that is my cup of space tea. But why? They take place in totally different settings with completely different plots. The pacing is different, as are the themes, but the narrators are very similar. Both are sarcastic, highly intelligent, resourceful, and brave. It's not the plot that keeps me coming back to those books, it's the characters. So when we talk about character, we're talking about the character's voice, their attitude, their values, their development. Plot is pretty straightforward. Some adults read nothing but cozy mysteries, for example, or James Patterson, because they love the plot structure. And kids are the same. Look at the popularity of those long kid series like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Nancy Clancy, The Boxcar Children, etc. And you'll see what I'm talking about. It's generally the same plot structure. The specifics change, obviously. You're not reading the same book over and over, but it's the same structure. And people tend to like those books because you can depend on them. Look at Harlequin romances. You can always depend on them to have a happy ending. In fact, that's literally one of the requirements for authors who are submitting their stories. It has to have a happy resolution. So let's talk about setting. It's also pretty straightforward. Some people prefer historical settings, some prefer contemporary, others fantastical. Some people are very specific and want things that are, say, at sea or in a jungle. The problem that we tend to run into with setting is that there are some very broad settings that we refer to, such as historical settings or fantasy settings. And obviously, like I said, those are extremely broad terms. You could have something set in historical Victorian England that's going to be completely different than something set in, say, the Ming Dynasty in China. So when we're talking about setting, we need to think a little bit deeper than the broad categorization that we would apply to a book. So language is a little bit more difficult to pin down. We're talking about the author's writing style. To be honest, this is the one that I struggle with the most. It's also the most difficult to pick up from reading a blurb, synopsis, or review. This is one of those times where web resources, say that 5 times fast, like Literature Map really come in handy because they give you recommendations based on author. And I just realized that I did not include Literature Map in my list of resources at the end of this workshop. So just go ahead and Google Literature Map. It's a really great resource. Genre is one of the easier elements on this list, and it's one of the ones that our catalogs handle best. You probably know that there's a huge debate in the library world right now about whether we should be genrefying our collections. That is, sorting by genre rather than alphabetically by author surname or DDS, kind of like a bookstore, like Barnes and Noble would do. So personally, when I read, I gravitate towards fantasy and sci-fi. When I go into a bookstore, those are the sections I'm hitting up first. Genre is a great element to look at, but don't let it blind you to other titles that you might overlook because they don't fit the genre. I got into Stephen King because I was reading a lot of fantasy. I never considered his books fantasy. I always thought of them as horror, and that wasn't something I was into at the time. But there was, I believe it was a list on Goodreads that listed one of his books as fantasy, and I went ahead and I picked it up and I loved it. I would have missed out on one of the greatest authors of our time if I had stuck entirely to genre. So pacing, like language, is another one of those elements that is difficult to ascertain without reading the book. Sometimes reviews will tell you whether it's a slow build or fast paced, but a lot of the time you're left in the dark. This is one of those times that those anecdotally compiled lists we'll talk about later really come in handy. So, mood, let's talk about mood. Mood is a bigger one than we probably tend to think. There are times when, no matter how engaging the prose or characters, I just do not want to read a story with a sad mood. There are times when I definitely want suspense. I care less about what's actually going on than how it makes me feel. Believe it or not, despite what the old adage says, I find that the cover art can be a great indicator of mood. I'm not saying that you should rely on it, but it can certainly be a good indicator. Just think about the cover of the Graveyard Book compared to the cover of Dork Diaries. Just if you can picture them in your head, think about them and think about the colors. Graveyard Book, we have those those dark blues, those really muted colors that give you kind of a sense of what the story is going to be like. Now, the Dork Diaries, we have those, that bright purple, that cheetah print. We have those almost neon looking colors interspersed sometimes. And that definitely gives you a clue that this is going to have a very different mood than the Graveyard Book would. So the last one on our list, format, that's an interesting one. When we talk about format, we could be talking about whether we want a print book, an ebook, audio, comic, podcast, or we could be talking about the form that the story takes place within. Is it a diary, a letter? Does the writer use first, second, or third person narrative? That's part of format too. Personally, I cannot stand second person narratives or stories in the form of letters. Epistolary just does not work for me. If I know that an author uses either of these, I will not even pick the book up. So, circling back to what I mentioned earlier about our catalogs only being able to do so much, this is what I'm referring to. We catalog by subject heading, right? But subject heading just doesn't cover a lot of the elements that make a book appealing. We won't talk about fleshing out records with metadata or adding community tags in this webinar, but keep it in the back of your mind when you're doing your RA. Librarians used controlled vocabulary that readers just don't. So I want to take a couple of minutes here to do a little activity. Basically, what I would like you all to do is to think of a story you've either read or listened to lately or know really well. Just take a few minutes to identify the elements of the story. You don't have to write essays, just identify each element to the best of your abilities. Often when you're conducting a reader's advisory interview, in fact, the vast majority of the time, you're going to be getting very short answers back when you ask the interviewee about these elements. So go ahead, take a minute, and think about this.